Thank you for listening to Value-Based Care Insights, a podcast by Lumina Health Partners. In this series, host Daniel J. Marino, managing partner of Lumina, talks to top experts and thought leaders in healthcare to help you navigate on the journey to value-based care in an ever-changing landscape of the industry. The goal of this series is to bring you disruptive success strategies by leveraging Lumina's experiences, stories, and insights from working with health professionals and organizations across the country. Before we get into today's episode, I'd like to invite you to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and let us know what you think about the episode and any questions that are top of mind. Now let's get started.
Welcome to another episode of Value-Based Care Insights. I'm your host, Daniel Marino. I'm really excited about today's episode. Today actually marks our 50th podcast episode of Value-Based Care Insights. Thinking back over the last 2.5 years and the 50 episodes that we've done, there has been some great information, great insights, great guests, and just fantastic topics that we've had and been very fortunate to share it with all of our listeners and with many organizations. To help me talk about these episodes and kind of reflect on the last couple of years, I've invited my colleague, Lucy Zielinski, to join me. Lucy, welcome to the program.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited about this. It's just amazing thinking back that we've recorded 50 episodes. When we started this, I got to tell you, I didn't even think we were going to do 10, let alone 50.
Dan, I don't think you knew what a podcast host was all about.
I really didn't. And I could remember way back when I think it was you and a couple of my colleagues, one of which was Shelly Chopra. For a while there, she was our co-host with me. She was talking to me about the direction of podcast and that this would be a great way to be able to share a lot of thoughts and to educate folks. And I got to tell you, I was skeptical right off the bat, but I'll tell you, it has turned out to be something far and away exceeding my expectations on what we would accomplish with these podcasts.
Dan, I think you've done a phenomenal job, and it really lends well to your expertise. I mean, you wear those shoes in the healthcare environments, in the provider space, working with physicians, working with hospitals. So I think all of that wisdom to be able to share that with listeners is very important. So Dan, let me turn the tables on you today. Can I, just for today, one episode 50, can I play host and can you be the guest?
Absolutely. I think this would be fun. Let's do it. Let's reflect on what we've learned and what we've done and maybe where we're going.
All right, let me ask the questions, Dan. So as I think back, when you first started this, I remember looking at some of the data and we had less than 50 downloads. And now, as I look at the episodes and all the downloads, there are even episodes that have 2,000 downloads. Wow, that's pretty amazing. And what's really amazing is that the total plays for the 49 episode that you've done have totaled over 35,000. And I know adding more platforms, Apple, Spotify, Anchor, and really being syndicated on healthcare radio now has helped that growth. So how does it feel, Dan, for you to see that growth?
It's exciting at one respect and it's humbling in another. You know, part of what I think has been a foundation of our consulting firm, Lumina, is the fact that we've really focused on educating our leaders, educating the healthcare industry, sharing information and sharing insights. And I've done that all through my career. The podcasts that we've created, the episodes and really value-based care insights have just given us that greater opportunity to share insights. And I'll tell you, I get a lot of my information, my knowledge from talking with leaders across the country. I bet you from one week to the next, I probably talk to anywhere between 10 to 15 leaders, hearing what they do and sort of the challenges that they have. And I wrap all that information into the podcast through guests and so forth, really trying to touch on the issues of today that are affecting the healthcare industry.
Yeah, that's very important. As you mentioned, being in the healthcare space, having that hands-on knowledge, I think it's been over 30 years for you, hasn't it been?
Oh gosh, isn't that scary? Yes, it has.
For me as well. Do you remember the days of the ledger cards and green bar reports? I'm ashamed to say, I think that's when we started.
Yeah, it was. It certainly was. Come a long way since then.
Absolutely. And now there's powerful analytics and really innovation at its best with care delivery. We've made a lot of advances. And you mentioned this a moment ago, the word insights. That just keeps on standing out for me. The word insights, and it's even in our title, value-based care insights. So what insights, when you first started this podcast, did you really want to share with our listeners?
One of the areas that I think is a continued challenge for many leaders is they often when they're thinking about solving problems, they're very focused on the crisis at hand. And what they know is really around what's in their four walls or what's in their organization. A lot of times it's difficult for us to separate ourselves from those internal constraints that we have and to focus on how other people are doing it or how they're solving those problems. So the background, or really the focus around value-based care insights and insights in general, is to broaden the perspective of these leaders, to give them some other views, other ways of thinking through things, other solutions to help them solve their problems. And I can think way back when we started this, really around value-based care, everybody was trying to figure it out, right? And one of the common things that I heard from, if I heard it from one CFO, I must have heard it from 20, is how do we quantify the value of population health? So we spent some time, if you remember in those early days, kind of talking about how other people created that value, how they saw an ROI. And I'll tell you, the feedback that I had from many CFOs at that time was that, hey, we didn't have all the answers, but it was great to hear how other people were doing it. And we were able to incorporate a lot of those learnings into our own organization. That's the success I love to hear coming out of the podcast.
Yeah, it's sharing those insights and sitting on that bird perch, because many organizations don't take a pause and learn and see what others are doing. And I know, Dan, you lead many organizations and facilitate retreats with boards and senior leaders. And so that experience also, I'm sure, has given you some intel and insight into what's going on in the organizations, what direction should they go into, and what they can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that's a big value that I think we as an organization, as a consulting firm, bring to a lot of our clients, is being able to share that knowledge and to share kind of the lessons learned that, we've learned from other organizations, or that we can connect one organization with to another organization to share some of those insights, some of those lessons learned. And I'll tell you, and I keep going back to this, part of, as much as I've enjoyed sharing learnings with a lot of the listeners, I myself have learned a great deal from talking to people around the country, from having guests on, just engaging in really intellectually stimulating conversations, topics, and so forth. I've learned probably as much from them as hopefully they've learned from me.
Yeah, so let's talk about those guests, Dan. You've had some interesting people over the last 49 episodes. And I know it's fun for you to have these conversations from folks from different areas, different unique roles in the healthcare industry, from finance to operation to technology and innovative companies. So what guests have been impressive to you? What guests stand out for you?
Well, I think a couple of them. One guest, or actually guests that I had on, were a colleague of ours, Steve Berger, who's a former CFO, and Dr. George Mazel, who was a chief medical officer. And the topic that we talked about was creating the rapport between finance leaders and clinical leaders. And I can remember in that podcast, it was such a fun podcast. I remember in that podcast, we talked about value and how you define value. And Dr. Mazel, of course, took it from the clinical perspective, and Steve stopped him and started to chime in from the finance perspective. And although both of these gentlemen were correct on their definition, how they went about it and the debate that they had was fascinating. And I'll tell you, I felt more like a referee than I did a podcast host at that time. It was just great. The rapport, the conversation, and so forth that we had, that was definitely one that stood out.
Dan, as a matter of fact, that's the podcast with Healthcare Radio Now That was the most listened to podcast out of all 49.
It was, yeah. Yeah, you're right. And I'll tell you, it really, it was a fun podcast for me, mostly because the way that they approached it, I'm sure it's very similar to the type of discussions that occur in many healthcare organizations around the country, when you have the physicians taking the perspective of the clinical view, and then you have the finance leader taking the perspective of the finance view, right? And both of them are right, but they come at it from a different perspective. And it was just, I couldn't say enough about the podcast. It was a lot of fun.
Isn't the saying that we say no margin, no mission, or is it no mission, no margin?
Yeah, well, that's very true. No doubt about it.
So Dan, who was another guest that impressed you?
Well, I can remember when COVID hit and a lot of people were just clamoring for information. You know, we were all locked down around March, April, May of 2020, and everybody was trying to figure out what to do and where to get information and so forth. And one of the guests that I had on was Dr. Mike Hill, who was an infectious disease physician out of St. Tammany Parish down in just a little bit north of New Orleans. And Dr. Hill was great. And being an infectious disease physician specialist, he's very much focused on the data and on the numbers. And we recorded the podcast. I can remember it was probably around early part of June. And he gave such a different perspective on what the data means and how to take that data on the infection rate of COVID and really push it out to the community. And they took such a different perspective within their organization on how they were attacking COVID, so to speak, and how they were treating patients. I thought that was fantastic. And again, that one really resonated with me because, you know, we were only getting our information from the news at that time. And, you know, it was very challenging to really find out what was real versus, you know, what was sort of vaporware information. And Dr. Hill brought such a clear perspective of that. And it was something that, again, they really wrapped into their clinical approach, their care models, and so forth. I really enjoyed that podcast as well.
Yeah, it sounds like that data is so important to turn that into information and then communicate that information to all of the stakeholders, right? Physicians, patients, healthcare executives, leaders, and so on, because that then creates a sound leadership structure.
Absolutely. You know, another one that stood out for me too, Lucy, was we've had a few on related to technology. And I think a couple of the other ones that we had were really around how we were using technology to create more direct virtual health and connectiveness with patients. That was one that was really good. I know, you know, even in the early parts of the pandemic, you know, again, everybody was sort of trying to figure out what telehealth meant. We did a couple of podcasts on that. Those were some other really good ones. I really enjoyed those as well.
I think as I took a look at the data, leadership, operational efficiencies, financial type topics seem to be the most downloaded topics. So as you think about some of those topics, Dan, in the 49th episode, what are maybe 3 pearls of wisdom or insights that you gleaned that listeners should know?
Well, I think one, and we sort of touched on this, is that, you know, as organizations are starting to solve problems or attack problems, particularly those that are more strategic in nature, it's great to be able to, you know, look for information or share information or understand how other people are doing it. Those lessons learned to be able to incorporate into their own learnings, I think, is really key. And one of the things I'm particularly proud of is we've got a library of 49 podcasts and it's growing, right? So if leaders have a question or if they have a problem or if they want to be able to see how other people have attacked these issues, my hope is that they're going to the library and downloading those or at least listening to them. That would be number one. I think the second thing a big takeaway from this is that, you know, sharing of the network is really key. And I would encourage many of our listeners to reach out to me directly. And especially if you just want to have a conversation, you know, I think to be able to share those insights, to be able to hear how, you know, you're attacking certain problems or to hear how other folks are attacking certain problems, or just to share quick wins. Boy, I love that. And I wrap a lot of those learnings into our discussion. And then I think the third piece here is I try to stay on the cutting edge. I want to be able to deliver information that is exciting to folks, that is at the top of the industry, topics that really provide a level of strategic thought as well as operational, let's say, solutions, if you will, that help organizations advance. And I think we've been able to do that across all of our 49 episodes so far.
Dan, it sounds like three things: gleaning from others, sharing a network, and really staying current.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think those are the key things. And when we talk to people, and I've often, asked people all the time, what have they liked or not liked about the podcasts? Those are the three things that have resonated with them, and which I'm happy to hear. That's alignment with what our goals are for the podcast as well.
As we talk about goals of the podcast, as we're moving into this year, right? What are some of those healthcare trends or topics that you would like to focus on or talk about or have guests to discuss with? What are some of those topics?
About 3 weeks ago, maybe a little longer than that, we did a webinar on the top 10 trends that healthcare providers need to be concerned with or looking to as they move into 2022. And it was a pretty successful sharing of information. As I think about, pardon me?
I said I was there too.
You were. I know we did it together. We did a great job. I thought, it was great feedback on that webinar. And as I reflect back on those and think about where the industry is going, there's three of them that really sort of resonate or are the high priority ones. And I would say rebuilding operating margins for healthcare organizations, for hospitals. We have to get back to the point where we were pre-COVID. Pre-COVID wasn't all that great, but it's better than it is now. So we're going to be providing a lot of insights for organizations, for leaders, as to how they could kind of realign themselves and get themselves back to a point where, at least from an operating margin perspective, they're at that pre-COVID level and hopefully beyond. I think the second is that the care model has changed. We will never go back to how it was pre-COVID. Virtual health has changed the way we're delivering care. Primary care in and of itself has been revolutionized through virtual health. Even urgent care has been revolutionized. So we're going to have quite a few guests on that are talking about that evolving care model. And the last one, which I think is really important, is we have to deal with the workforce issues that we have here. We're seeing many organizations who are short-staffed, many organizations who have staff that are burned out, many organizations who are focusing on improving physician wellness. We are going to spend quite a bit of time talking about that and sharing some insights. And Lucy, this is the perfect example on how organizations can learn from other organizations. There are so many organizations across the country who are putting in place different initiatives to address physician wellness, workforce-related issues, retention issues, and so forth. My goal is to get those leaders on the podcast, have them share stories, and be able to share those insights. That's really my hope for this next year.
Those are great topics, Dan. I'm looking forward to hearing you and hearing our guests speak about those topics. One of the other topics I would add to that is leadership. I think leadership is so critical, especially today, with all of the changes and all of the pressures that are occurring in healthcare. It really takes an individual to be a solid leader, to be effective. And having emotional intelligence is so important. It's not like the old days where you just told someone to do something to do and they would do it. There are many things to consider these days, especially as you're working in a team. Many of these organizations have dyad structures where they're teaming up, physicians, clinical people, staff with executives, and to be able to work together collectively, collaboratively, in unison working towards the same strategy or the same vision is so important. So I think that's another topic that would be worthwhile.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, as we start to think about developing of our leaders of tomorrow, as you mentioned, I think there's some key things to consider. Emotional intelligence is one, change management is another. Dealing with the operational and strategic issues of organizations could potentially be a third. And it's not only important to develop the senior leaders, but it's also really important to develop the middle managers. In many organizations, when we were dealing with COVID, the senior leaders had to kind of take the reins, right? And make sure that everything was performing, but it created a lot of stress for the middle manager level. And it created a lot of stress for the physician leaders as well, too. So I'm excited to be able to share insights as to how, say, we can provide greater leadership development for middle managers, for physician leaders, that will help these organizations sort of push down the decision-making and just make them much more effective and much stronger as an organization.
Sounds like you have some great topics that are up and coming. So I'm looking forward to that. So Dan, just as you end your podcast, I want to ask you, what final thoughts or advice do you have for our listeners?
Well, as we mentioned, I enjoy talking to people and hearing their stories. I enjoy sharing those stories with other people. I particularly enjoy education, teaching, and just sharing those insights. And as I've said before, I think to me, that knowledge transfer, that ability to educate is invaluable to a leader. It's invaluable to an organization. And frankly, it's invaluable to our industry. That's how our industry is going to press forward and really solve these problems of today and tomorrow. So I guess a final thought would be to, again, don't be afraid to reach out. Don't be afraid to network. Take advantage of the tools and the access and the information that is out there. We're very fortunate that with the internet, and even particularly within Lumina, but even beyond Lumina with other organizations, there's so much free content, free information that is out there. Use that. Use it within the way that you manage. Use it within your ability to grow your organization, and then share the stories. Ask for help. A lot of times it's hard for individuals to ask for help. You sort of are very, folks become very proud of what you've been able to do. And sometimes it's hard to get outside that comfort zone. But I'll tell you, those that do are very glad that they did, and they're able to take those learnings and advance their own organization. So probably a little bit more of a long-winded answer than you wanted, but those are my thoughts.
Oh, and I know you mean that, Dan, and really on behalf of you and me and the rest of our Lumina Health Partners team, I think all of us want to contribute to the healthcare industry and give back our knowledge. We've been doing work in this field for many years, and it really feels good for us to be able to help an organization move forward and really succeed in a trying environment. So keep on doing what you're doing.
Well, thanks, Lucy. And hey, by the way, good job being the podcast host for today.
But I'm going to hand it back to you to wrap.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, I again want to thank all of our listeners for, over 2.5 great years, 49 episodes, and we're looking forward to well beyond 49 going forward. It's been a lot of fun. Love sharing the stories, and I am looking forward to having some great guests invited on our podcast. And if any of you, as I mentioned, are interested in sharing your story or having a conversation or just saying hello, please feel free to reach out. Again, my email is dmarino@luminahp.com. Please reach out. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, thank you again for listening. This is Value-Based Care Insights. I'm your host, Daniel Marino.
We want to thank you for listening to Value-Based Care Insights podcast by Lumina Health Partners. Lumina is your partner on a journey to value-based care and all the pivots and challenges our industry faces daily. To learn more about us, visit us on luminahp.com. If you found value in today's conversation, subscribe to us on all major podcast platforms, including Apple and Spotify, and leave us feedback. Be sure to check out our show notes at luminahp.com/insights. Join us again where we continue to take a deep dive into what lies ahead and invite conversations with some of our colleagues and industry thought leaders on new trends that are emerging and how we continue to navigate and thrive. Until then, have a great day and stay safe.